It had been a long year. Becoming parents had been the most beautiful, exhausting experience of our lives. And after months of sleepless nights, endless diaper changes, and navigating our new world, we finally decided we needed a break. Just one weekend to reconnect, to breathe in the fresh air, and to remember who we were before we became mom and dad. My husband, James, and I packed up the car, loaded our dog Max into the back seat, and headed for the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. We had always loved camping, and this trip, our first anniversary since our daughter's birth, felt like the perfect way to celebrate. After a few hours on the road, we arrived at the park. The towering trees, dense and lush, created a cocoon of quietness around us. We drove deeper into the park, looking for a quiet lake we had read about, somewhere secluded but not entirely isolated. It took us nearly an hour to find the perfect spot, a small clearing near the water's edge, surrounded by thick forest, with only a few other campers scattered in the distance. The lake reflected the late afternoon sky, and for a moment I felt the stress of the past year melt away. James and I spent the next couple of hours setting up camp, pitching our tent, and gathering wood for the fire. Max roamed around happily, sniffing every tree and rock, his tail wagging non-stop. Once everything was in place, we decided to explore the area. We hiked along a narrow, winding trail. The peace of the forest was intoxicating, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like we could truly relax. It was during this hike that we first saw him. A man. He was lying in a hammock at a nearby campsite, his body completely still. He wasn't reading, wasn't looking at his phone, wasn't even sleeping, just staring. His eyes followed us as we passed, and though I tried to convince myself that he was simply people watching, something about his motionlessness sent a chill up my spine. James noticed it too. He gave my hand a reassuring squeeze, and we kept walking. Max, usually oblivious to strangers, unless they had food, let out a low growl as we passed the man's campsite. James tugged his leash, and we hurried along, not speaking until we were well past him. "That was weird, right?" I finally asked. "Yeah," James admitted. "But maybe he's just a strange guy. Let's not overthink it." I nodded, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in my gut. We returned to our own campsite as the sun began to set. We made dinner over the fire, laughing as Max tried to sneak bites of our food, and for a while, everything felt normal. But then, at the middle of the night, Max started acting strange. His ears perked up, his body stiffened, and then he let out a deep, guttural growl, the kind we had never heard from him before. He was staring into the trees. My heart pounded as I followed his gaze, but I saw nothing. James grabbed the flashlight and shone it toward the woods. The light landed on something that made my stomach drop. A man, lying down on the trail. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, the figure stirred. He pushed himself up, dusted himself off, and turned toward us. It was the man from the hammock. He walked into our campsite without hesitation, without a word. He sat down near our fire as if he had been invited. My breath caught in my throat as I took a step closer to James. Up close, his face expressionless. He didn't look homeless, but there was something off about him. His hands fidgeted constantly, his fingers moving as though they were searching for something. A knife? A gun? I had no idea, but my mind raced with possibilities. James cleared his throat. "Hey, man, you okay?" The man didn't answer. He just stared into the fire, his fingers still moving in his pocket. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. Max was rigid beside me, his growl never ceasing. We felt trapped. James and I exchanged a glance, unspoken agreement passing between us. We needed to go. Moving as calmly as we could, we began packing up our gear. The man didn't react, didn't say a word. He just sat there, staring into the flames. My hands trembled as I rolled up our sleeping bags, stuffing them into the car. James kept an eye on him the entire time, his body tense. As I threw the last bag into the trunk, I turned back toward the fire. The man was gone. I whipped my head around, looking around the darkness, my heart pounding in my ears. And then I saw him. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the firelight. Watching. We didn't wait. James slammed the trunk shut, and we jumped into the car. Max leapt in after us, still growling. James started the engine. We sped away. Actions were not normal. Maybe he was looking for the opportunity to attack us. Even though we had chosen a spot that wasn't completely isolated, with some campers nearby, we still felt afraid. Our child was small, and we didn't want any trouble. James also made it clear we're never camping there again. I had planned this solo camping trip for months. Between my college classes, my part-time job at the bookstore, and the suffocating routine of everyday life, I was desperate to get away. The deep woods of North Carolina had always called to me. So, when the weekend finally arrived, I threw my gear into the back of my friend's borrowed car, eager for the peace I craved for Nantahala National Forest. It was a 3-hour drive from the city, winding through twisting mountain roads until civilization disappeared behind me. By the time I reached my chosen campsite, miles from the nearest town, the sun was beginning to set. I found a perfect spot near a small clearing, surrounded by towering trees and the soft rustling of unseen creatures. After setting up my tent, I hung my hammock between 2 sturdy pines, cracking open a beer as I sank into its embrace. I smoked a cigar, the rich burn of tobacco adding to my euphoria. The fire crackled in front of me, its glow casting long, flickering shadows across the trees. I wasn't scared. I had always prided myself on being tough. I had hiked alone before. This was my escape, my moment of peace. But peace is an illusion. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to something pressing against my tent. I froze. At first, I thought it was the wind, maybe an animal brushing past. Then I heard it, light footsteps crunching the leaves outside. Slow, deliberate, circling. My mouth went dry. I reached for my knife, gripping it so tight. My heart pounded in my ears, so loud I thought it would give me away. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. Then silence. Minutes stretched. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was just my paranoia. And then, just as I started to relax, I heard slight movement outside my tent. My stomach clenched as adrenaline surged through me. Someone was outside for sure. I bolted upright, fumbling with the zipper of my tent, hands shaking. I needed to see what was happening. Maybe it was a bear. Maybe. I never got the chance to finish that thought. As soon as I stumbled out, it was a hand on my throat. I barely had time to scream before I was yanked backward, my feet scraping against the dirt as a massive arm locked around my chest. Hot breath reeked against my ear. My mind shattered into pure panic. I thrashed, my knife slipping from my grip as I clawed at the arm crushing me. A rough voice hissed in my ear, words I couldn't make out through my own choking gasps. My lungs screamed for air. He was strong, overpowering, dragging me backward into the darkness. Then something snapped inside me. I twisted my head and sank my teeth into his hand. Hard. I bit down with everything I had. I felt the sickening crunch of bone. The bastard howled a guttural, agonized scream, and the grip on my throat loosened. I didn't let go. I tore into his flesh like an animal, my jaw locked down in sheer, mindless survival.
He shrieked and flung me away.
I hit the ground hard, spitting out the blood as I gasped for air. My vision blurred with panic, but I could still see him clutching his ruined hand, his breath ragged. Then he ran, disappearing into the trees, his scream still echoing. I scrambled to my feet, my legs trembling so violently I nearly collapsed. My knife. I needed my knife. Where the hell was my knife? But there was no time. I turned and ran, barefoot and bleeding, through the dark woods. I didn't stop. I didn't even realize I was crying until I reached the first house, a dimly lit cabin perched on the edge of the forest. I pounded on the door, screaming, not caring how pathetic or crazed I sounded. An old man answered, his eyes wide with confusion and alarm. I could barely get the words out between my gasps. Someone attacked me. He tried to. He let me inside, locking the door behind me as he called the cops. I sat on his couch, shaking uncontrollably, still tasting the bastard's blood in my mouth. When the police arrived, I told them everything. They searched my campsite, finding my knife where I had dropped it. But they also found something else. A gas can, sitting right next to my tent. And worse? Later, the cops suggested the attacker might wanted to kill you by fire. The police never found him. No trace. Just the gas can and some more disturbing items there. I cut the trip short, left everything behind. I packed my shit and swore never again. Never alone. Never in these mountains. Never this kind of terror again. I still don't know why he wanted this, why he wanted to kill me. I have no enemies. I'm just a simple person who wanted solitude. I was never prepared for the terror that turned my life into fear. My best friend and I had been planning a week of camping, hiking for losing ourselves in the beauty of the Appalachian Trail. There's something about the Maine wilderness that calls to you. I want something raw, endless stretch of dense trees. The idea was to disconnect from the chaos of life, breathe in the fresh air. We set out early on a crisp September morning, our packs loaded with supplies. The plan was to hike deep into the forest, set up camp, and spend our days exploring. The first day went as smoothly as we'd hoped. The air was cool, the ground dry. We followed the trail for miles, talking about everything and nothing, feeling free in the way only the wilderness allows. By late afternoon, we found the perfect clearing and pitched our tent. The night was peaceful, the sky full of stars. We sat by the fire, ate our freeze-dried meals, and listened to the sounds of the forest. There was something almost sacred about the stillness. We fell asleep with the comforting rustling of leaf sounds. The next day, we set out again, eager to push further. The trail was well worn, but we barely saw another soul out of the trail. That's when we first heard the noises, strange, high-pitched yipping sounds through the trees. My friend and I exchanged glances. "What the hell is that?" he asked. The sounds weren't quite right, too deliberate, almost human. Still, we brushed it off and kept walking. By late afternoon, the weather began to turn. Dark clouds rolled in, and the wind picked up. We checked our map and saw there was a shelter up ahead, one of those wooden lean-tos meant for hikers looking for quick refuge. The idea of staying dry was tempting, so we decided to head that way. As we approached the shelter and we saw him, a man sitting on the wooden platform, hunched over, muttering to himself. He looked wrong. His clothes were ragged, his hair matted, and there was a wildness in his eyes that made my stomach twist. My friend and I exchanged a look, our silent language saying everything we needed to. Still, we didn't want to be rude. We greeted him cautiously. "Hey, man," I said. "Mind if we crash here for the night?" He looked up sharply, as if he hadn't realized we were there. His eyes darted between us before he gave a slow nod. "It's a free country." We set our packs down but kept our distance, exchanging small talk just to gauge the situation. His name, he told us, was Bobby Joe. He spoke in circles, his thoughts scattered and erratic. 1 second, he was talking about hiking. The next, he was mumbling about voices in the trees, about people following him, about how they were watching. Then, just after that, the rain started. It came down in torrents, cold and relentless, turning the dirt to sludge. The idea of hiking in it was miserable, but staying here trapped in a 3-walled shelter with this unstable man was worse. My friend leaned in. "Dude, I don't like this." "Me neither," I muttered. "We should go." The man's eyes snapped to us. "You leaving?" It wasn't a question. It was a challenge. "Yeah," I said. "Weather's rough, but we'll manage." "Brave or stupid?" Neither of us replied. We grabbed our packs and started moving, our boots sloshing through the mud. The rain hammered down, soaking us to the bone. We walked fast. My heart pounded, but I didn't look back. Even after we'd put miles between us and that shelter, the feeling of being watched never left. We didn't stop until we were far enough away to feel safe, then set up our tent in the least exposed area we could find. We barely slept that night. By morning, the fear hadn't faded. The whole trip felt tainted. What if we hadn't left? What if he had snapped in the middle of the night? What if we had woken up to something far worse than rain? "Let's go home," my friend finally said. I nodded. The adventure wasn't worth the risk anymore. We packed up and left the forest, our dream trip cut short by a gut feeling we couldn't ignore. I tried to push the experience to the back of my mind, chalk it up to bad luck, but the unease lingered. Then the real terror begins. 2 weeks later, I saw his name in the news. Bobby Joe. My stomach turned as I read the headline. Bobby Joe, a mental patient, attacked hikers on the Appalachian Trail. 1 dead. A man named Billy Ray had been stabbed to death at a campsite. Others had been chased through the woods, fleeing for their lives. It was him, the man we had met, the man we had walked away from. I felt sick. My hands shook as I reread the article, the details making my blood run cold. He had threatened hikers with a machete, taunted them, hunted them. The question kept circling in our minds. What if we had stayed at that shelter? What if we had ignored our instincts? We almost died. We had brushed shoulders with a killer. We had sat beside him, spoken to him, felt his madness creeping under our skin. And if the weather had been just a little worse, if we had been just a little less cautious, our names might have been in that article too. That trip changed me. It made me trust my instincts in a way I never had before. The wilderness is beautiful, but it's also unpredictable. And sometimes, the most dangerous thing out there isn't the weather or the wildlife. It's the people.